Welcome to another weekly session of Informally Formal. I am really excited today because today's topic is the future of education. Something that is personally very dear to me, as many of my audiences may or may not know. I started my career in America teaching at a university for several years before I went into the corporate world. To talk about this very important subject, we have someone from the first state in the United States, the state of Delaware, Faizal Chaudhury. He is the vice president and in charge of customer experience, vice president of Customer Centricity, they call it, for Sallie Mae. It's a $20 billion organization with about 1,800 people across the United States. Faizal has an MBA degree from University of Chicago's Booth School, the very, very prestigious school. And he has worked previously for TD Bank, for Bank of America in senior management positions. So welcome, Faizal.
Al, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Faizal also sits on several other boards and stuff in America, and also serves as an adjunct faculty at University of Delaware. But in any event, all of that aside, let me get into my first question. Faizal, from your vantage point, what do you see as the future of education?
Right. I think it's in the midst of tremendous change. I think that's the one thing we should all keep in mind. And the old adage that the only constant is change couldn't be more truer in the education industry too, right? And I think the pandemic is obviously going to accelerate a lot of these trends we're going to talk about. But that's what I would say. It's really in the midst of a tremendous change. And as we continue our dialogue, we can dive a little bit deeper into what some of these changes are. But that's my one minute answer to the first question.
Right. Yeah, absolutely true. But wouldn't you say, Faizal, that this COVID has impacted the education arena quite a bit, as it has every other industry, from every walk of life, we find ourselves impacted by this pandemic. But education in particular has been impacted quite a bit. So would you shed light on that? And then, of course, you did say it in one sentence, but I know there is a whole lot more we want to get out of you. So go ahead.
So I think absolutely correct. What this pandemic has done is accelerated a lot of the trends that we were seeing to begin with, right? So in the past, some schools were offering some courses that would be online, because it's in line with the fourth industrial revolution. It's all about the internet, so they wanted your students to be very adept in navigating the online environment. But I think what the pandemic has done is really accelerated the trend, obviously more out of necessity than anything else. So what this has done is really forced the focus on how can we provide a quality education, mostly through online means, right? And that has a lot of ramifications, and we can talk about that in more details in terms of what those ramifications could be, and what the financial implications are. Obviously now you're a businessman, so the bottom line is also important for us. The acceleration towards online learning has probably jumped 5 years as a result of the pandemic.
Right. Faizal, let me ask you, you allude to the fact that some changes were underway. One of them being the delivery mechanism, which the pandemic has now forced our hands into going into online format. But there's been other shift that was afoot even before the pandemic, especially with the fourth industrial revolution, with the fourth industrial revolution. There's been so many studies from the OECD, World Economic Forum, and what have you, that the education that is being delivered needs to drastically change. Your thoughts on that, Faizal?
Yeah, I do agree, and I'll quote Clay Christensen, who he passed away about a year ago, a recognized authority on disruption, right? One of the things he said way back in 2018 was probably 50% of the 40,000 or 4,000 educational institutes in the US would go bankrupt in the next 50 years or so, right? So which was a pretty bold statement to make, even before all this pandemic. So now as we talk about that shift, right? The delivery model for education US is basically a 4-year degree. Is that still relevant today? So some of the things that we talked about, I alluded to some change. There are some open courses. They call it MOOC, right? Mass online education. So for example, Coursera and Udemy, you may or may not have heard of those, but they deliver short form courses over the internet, right? Certifications was another trend that has been going on for a long time. As you know, Microsoft, Cisco, they all had their own certification. And then there were the online schools also, right? Again, the differentiating factor between them and most of your traditional school was, well, you can't replicate the innovation and the collaboration that happens when people meet in person. That's really the distinguishing factor, right? That's what, the larger institution could say, this is what we have that you don't have. Now let's sit today. Well, what are the bigger schools doing? And what are these upstart doing? At this point, it's the same, right? If you take away the in-person educational format, well, now everybody's on the same playing field. So some of the thornier questions that are coming up now from parents is, wait a minute, I'm paying so much more for my kid to go to college. But now you're giving this online education, which he could have got somewhere else, probably for much cheaper. So Mr. Big School, are you going to reduce the tuition this year? Are you going to freeze the tuition increase this year? What are you going to do? So the educational institutes are having to grapple with these very questions even as we speak, right? Because, as I said, I do work for an institution that works very closely with parents sending their kids to school, their children to school. And this is coming up more and more in their conversation now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's get a little deeper into fourth industrial revolution, if you will, Faizal, and help us understand, what does this entail for the education industry?
Yeah, I think so. The key thing, obviously the fourth industrial revolution all has to do with, the internet and how things are changing. And what I would introduce to you guys is, part of the fourth industrial revolution is also a shift to the experience economy, right? It's all about instant gratification these days, right? With the advent of your iPhone and everything else, you want everything and you want it now. Right? We're talking about like same day delivery here in the US. Amazon is coming up with, maybe 1 hour delivery by drone in a couple of hours, right? In a couple of years, right? So as you can see, so even in education, remember I just mentioned that, is 4-year degree still the right degree for the future? People nowadays are being fed instant gratification everywhere you go. Now you have to try to sell them a 4-year educational degree. So you can imagine if Google says that if you get one of our certification, which takes 3 months to 6 months, we will consider this the equivalent of a 4-year degree for the purposes of you applying for any jobs in Google. Can you imagine what kind of a disruptive force that is? If you don't adapt your experience to what is being demanded, you're going to be obsolete. Look at Blockbuster, and a lot of people might not know that, but a more recent example is Airbnb and the impact it's having on the hotel industry, or Uber that's having on the traditional taxi industry, right? It's, when you think about it, it's about the experience. Before, if you wanted a taxi, you go out in the street, it could be raining, it could be 115 degrees, and you just wait to hail a cab. Now you order your Uber and you know exactly when it's going to be. So if it's raining, you sit inside until the Uber is right out of your door, right? And then you just go out. So that's what I mean when I say it's the experience economy, right? Same thing with Airbnb. You get to pick exactly the room that you want with the exact view in the exact location versus just booking in a hotel and not knowing what room you're going to get. You could be on the top floor, bottom floor, next to the elevator, lots of noise, no noise, right? So when you think about it, these are all about experiences. That's what's disrupting these industries. So same thing with education too that we're talking about, that experience is going to disrupt the industry. So if the experience is that, hey, I want something quicker, I want something more flexible, how does the education industry then adapt to make sure that they're able to cater to this revised expectations?
Also, Faizal, I don't know if you have ever listened to Sir Ken Robinson. He is someone that I follow very closely. And he basically says that our educational institutions basically kills potential. So
Sure.
Kids go into this regimented, boxed-in environment, and they come out of it basically as robots. So what is needed in order to cope with the fast change of pace that we are seeing through fourth industrial revolution and whatever other industrial revolutions that we might see? is
Right.
one thing is for sure that whatever that you learned just a few years back is now absolutely obsolete. So one of
Yeah.
the things they talk about is the purpose of education is served when you're able to think outside of the box, when you're capable of doing critical thinking. And that may not be
Yeah.
in the format of a four-year school, the way we are used to.
Right. I'll cop to the fact that I don't follow Ken Robinson, but I wrote his name down, so I'll get up to speed on that. But I do agree with what he said, and it follows the conversation that we're even having, right? That is four-year degree teaching you the right things. So the other thing, I think you're correct. Like if you're studying, for example, engineering or other sciences, right? You might get typecast into doing some very, very narrow type of thing. And I think if you look at the World Economic Forum's top 10 skills for the fourth industrial revolution, and you go down the list, things like, complex problem solving or creative thinking or creativity, I think those are the top three, right? They all have to do with soft skills. It's good that you're going to have the hard skills to back that up, the technical competency. But more and more what's being valued, I think, is the soft skills. So one way to think about it also is, hopefully educational institutes are able to provide you with a lot of different templates so that you can utilize that template in whatever situation that you're in. It's going to be hard to find a one-size-fits-all for everything, right? But if they give you a flexible template that you're able to utilize, then no matter what situation you're in, you can utilize your own critical thinking, right? And apply a framework or a template and be able to apply it to whatever problem that you're looking to solve. So I think that's the way that educational institutes have to look at what they are providing as a commodity to the people who come to buy it, right? Is that, how can we prepare our customers, in this case students, for success, right? What kind of tools can we give them so that can be successful? I think the old way of thinking that, hey, these are the majors that you have and this is how you get it, versus how and what you need to be successful in the future has to change.
Right, right. I don't exactly remember the statistics, but it says something like, let's say you go into start college. By the time you graduate, so which is like 4 years, it's like 40 or 50% of what you've learned especially in the fourth industrial revolution is going to be, for the most part, is going to become irrelevant. It's going to become obsolete. So that's how fast change is happening. So we have to adapt. Our educational institutions have to adapt very, very quickly to this changed world that we're seeing, be it in the need for immediacy, the need for I want it right now, the customer experience. All of that, I think, is changing so very rapidly that the educational institutions need to adapt and adapt very quickly.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll give you one short example that one of my accounting professors gave me, right? When we were studying for the CPA exam, since we talked about, the CPA early on in the conversation, he told me the CPA exam is like a river that's a mile long, but it's only a foot deep, right? So once you memorize the stuff you need to memorize, there's so much thing that you have to learn for that exam, but they really don't go that deep into it, right? Because it will take too much time. You could be sitting in an exam for like 5-6 days if you wanted to do that. And he said, so keep that in mind. Once you wade through it, you are done. And then once you're in the workplace, I can guarantee you won't use more than 10% of what you learn, right? So I think, we have a common saying here, like mukhas to bidda, right? We'll learn everything, put everything in our mind. And I think that mindset has to change, because you're absolutely right. I can't, I'd be lying if I said I remember like more than 3 or 4% of what I learned for my CPA exam. Right. Even in my audit days and accounting days, I didn't use more than 10% max of what I learned for that exam. It was really what's being demanded on the job, right? And that's changing, as you said.
Yeah, Faizal, not to interrupt you, but the way I look at it, very simply put in one sentence, is the purpose of education is served if one is able to do independent thinking. That's it. Very simply put. You can talk about lots of skill sets and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, if you're capable of independent thinking, which means if it is a problem that's thrown your way that has not been defined prior to that, and your capacity to take it and come up with solutions That's if you're the difference between a well-formed mind and a well-educated mind.
Yeah.
So anyways, we are getting to the close tail end here. Faizal, how time flies, every time when we talk about something interesting, the time just flies by very quickly. So
Indeed.
Faizal, we cannot end this session without talking about the aspiring students that want to come to the United States for their higher education. And many of us, including me, I started my career the same exact way, went for graduate studies in the United States and then ended up staying there for 26 plus years.
Yeah.
Faizal, you've been there now, I think about the same length of time, right?
Yeah, I think almost 28 years.
Okay, so 28 years. So similar path. So we cannot end the session without really talking about, aspiring students. So anything that is changing that students from Bangladesh ought to bear in mind?
Yeah, I think obviously this pandemic will be hard for them because as you saw, there were certain changes in the policies by the government too that impacted them. So unfortunately, we're in a environment where politics is starting to come into play. So I would be remiss if I didn't say, look, that's going to play a big part in students from around the world and their ability to come to the U.S. So be on the lookout for what happens in November with regards to election in the U.S. because that could have a big impact for a lot of the students from Bangladesh trying to come to the U.S. But putting that aside, just in terms of what they should be doing, look, unfortunately, those standardized tests still play a very, very big role, right? So they need to focus on that. And hopefully they don't start thinking about coming to the US 6 months before they want to come to the US. As with anything, preparation is the key. So they should, once they're in, grade 9 and grade 10, they should be thinking about that already so that they can tell their life story better because ultimately that's what the admissions officer is looking at. Like, what's the life story of this student? Is he interesting? And you can make interesting in 2 months, right? Over maybe a course of a couple of years, you'll have a good story to tell the admissions officer, and that obviously will dramatically increase your chances of getting into the school that you want.
Right. One last thing, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, don't recognize, and neither did I. When I, as a young lad, I went to the United States, and that's the only dream I could dream of and go off. But one thing we don't realize is, I've raised kids in the United States, and we know, and you have kids of your own, Faizal, and we know how expensive it is. So from the time, estimates are like this, from the time a child is born to graduating from college, it costs anywhere between $250,000 to $500,000. That's the cost of raising a child. So when we send a kid that has an undergraduate degree, now in your case, I know you got your undergraduate degree in America as well. But when we, let's say, for example, send a kid that goes to United States or any other country for that matter, that's essentially between $250,000 to a $500,000 gift to the Western world. I have often talked about it. We always look at it from the standpoint of like the Western world is doing us such a great favor.
Yeah.
But there is another way to look at it. When a engineer like myself, graduate engineer from Buit, goes to United States, for the most part, the basic skill sets and stuff, they have all of that. And so they get the education, the free education or what have you, and all the money that the government spends back home, and then we take it and then spend the rest of our lives in the Western world. So another way to look at it, right? So we want the reason I say that is the last 10 years or so that I've been back here in Bangladesh after having spent so many years there, and which was some of the best years of my life, Faizal. No end of so buts about that. But then at the same time, I hail from Bangladesh, and I feel that I have certain responsibilities, and I want to give back to my nation. So nowadays, Bangladesh in so many ways is doing so stupendously well. So given that United States is still the largest economy in the world, but it's the age of Asia now, and so many economies in Asia are doing so very well. So I encourage kids to go to the United States, get your higher education, spend a few years and stuff, and then come back, perhaps look east very quickly. Any reflections on that?
I couldn't agree with you more. When I went in the early 90s, if I didn't know people who were well connected, or if I didn't have a lot of money to grease the wheels, my future would have been dark. But that's definitely not the case now with all the industries that we have, and the service industry too, right? There was no service industry back when we left. So I completely agree with you. I think
real
now
quickly,
there's a lot more opportunity for that.
right, real quickly, would you believe, in America, of course, we used to, when we got started in our careers and stuff, the first big hurdle was to get to a six-figure income, right?
Yeah.
Now, believe it or not, in Bangladesh, there are quite a few positions in six-figure US dollar.
And here's the one thing I want people to understand, right? Because the tax system in the US is very different. So exactly what you said, you make six-figure in Bangladesh in US dollar versus six-figure in the US, you are way better off in Bangladesh, right off the bat, right? And I won't make any comment beyond just the taxation system, but we know how different the tax system in Bangladesh is versus the tax system in America.
Even though, by the way, Faizal, Dhaka has become a very expensive city to live in. It's really a very expensive city, because a car that you bought, that you buy in America for $40,000 would cost you like $160,000 here in Bangladesh. So in some ways, the cost of living is quite expensive especially in the major city like Dhaka, Chittagong, and what have you.
No question.
But in any event, it was wonderful. It was a delight to talk to you, Faizal. And I'm sure we will talk some more on other topics and stuff, because one of my goals in this informally formal is to bring in successful Bangladeshi, be it Bangladeshi American or Bangladeshi Brits or from anywhere else that are doing very well in those economies and stuff, to bring in and hopefully bridge, what the learning is from the Western world, and some of those practices and thoughts, if we can translate here into Bangladesh.
Absolutely. I applaud your effort. Thank you for having me. Look forward to having future conversations with you.
All right, Faizal, thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you for your time. And to my audience, I would leave with an invitation for you to join us again next week. And with that, stay safe. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.